She was just a little girl when she placed her hand in the palm of a lonely cowboy and whispered, "One day, I'll marry you." Everyone laughed, but 20 years later, she returned to keep that promise. In a town divided by whispers, and with a powerful rancher standing in their way, their love became more than a vow. It became a battle for hope, loyalty, and a future together. If you're watching this right now, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below, I'd love to know. Wishing you a beautiful day, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story that just might touch your heart even deeper. The evening sun lingered over Silver Creek, Montana, painting the horizon with streaks of crimson and gold as the last of the day clung to the sky. The town sat nestled between rolling foothills and the jagged teeth of the Rockies, a place where dust rose with every wagon wheel and the scent of pine and sage lingered on the wind. Its main street was lined with weathered wooden storefronts, their paint flaking, porches creaking under boots, and lamps beginning to glow as townsfolk finished their chores. Children darted past the general store chasing a ball of twine. Women carried baskets of bread from Mrs. Dawson's bakery, and the faint tune of a fiddle floated from the open saloon doors. Silver Creek was alive, but beneath the noise ran the low hum of a town that carried more secrets than it admitted. And that evening, those secrets seemed ready to stir. At the far edge of town stood a ranch marked by sturdy fences and a wide corral. There lived Jace Callahan, a man both respected and feared in equal measure. At 38, Jace was built like a fortress, his frame broad and muscular, carved by years of breaking wild mustangs and hauling timber from dawn until dusk. His black hair, cut uneven by his own knife, was streaked with threads of silver, and his jaw bore a thin scar that caught the lantern light when he turned his head. He carried himself with the deliberate stillness of a man who had endured too much and said too little. Years earlier, a fire had taken his younger brother, and though Jace had escaped the flames with his life, he had never escaped the silence that followed. He worked harder than most, spoke less than all, and wore his grief like armor. Folks in town said Jace Callahan had muscles of iron and a heart of stone, though the truth was softer and lonelier than any cared to know. In the pasture beyond the barn grazed Redwind, a mustang as dark as midnight, his coat shimmering with blue undertones where the sun struck. Redwind was 7, all lean muscle and restless energy, a creature born for open plains and storms. He had once been pulled half-drowned from a raging river by Jace's steady hands, a memory no one in Silver Creek forgot. Since then, Redwind had chosen to linger at the ranch, though never fully tamed. He would vanish into the hills for days, only to return with burrs tangled in his mane and defiance in his eyes. To everyone else, he was untouchable. To Jace, he was both mirror and companion, a symbol of untamed loyalty and shared solitude. Their bond was not one of master and beast, but of two survivors who had chosen each other. Years before, Silver Creek had witnessed a curious moment, half comedy, half prophecy, that still lived in whispers around supper tables. A little girl named Clara Whitmore, freckles bright against her sunburnt cheeks, had once declared with childish certainty that she would marry Jace Callahan someday. It had not been in front of a crowd, though. The story grew twisted in, retelling, but the truth was quieter. Clara had said it in the shadow of the old church, her small hand clutching a doll missing an arm, her green eyes fearless as she watched Jace repair a broken wagon wheel. Jace, covered in dust, had paused to listen, offering her only a crooked smile. "One day, when I'm grown," she had insisted, "I'll marry you, Jace." He had not laughed. He had only nodded once, touched by a promise so innocent it pierced deeper than any blade. To him, it had become less a vow and more a thread tied to memory, one that returned to him in lonely nights like the echo of a child's laughter. Now, 12 years later, Clara Whitmore returned to Silver Creek. She stepped down from a stagecoach on that golden evening, her auburn hair braided tight against the wind, her figure slender but no longer childlike, her freckles softened into grace rather than mischief. She wore a simple blue travel dress, its hem frayed from the road, and boots polished though, worn at the toes. What struck the townsfolk was not her beauty alone, but the steadiness in her posture, the resolve in her emerald eyes. No longer a child chasing ribbons, Clara carried herself like a woman who had learned both longing and strength. She paused on the boardwalk, adjusting the strap of her satchel, and for a moment it seemed as though the town itself held its breath. From the corner post near the sheriff's office leaned Eli Grant, Silver Creek's lawman and once Jace's closest friend. Eli was in his 40s, tall and wiry, with a lean face carved by sun and worry. His hair was graying beneath the brim of his hat, his brown eyes sharp yet tired from years of holding peace in a place where tempers sparked quicker than prairie fires. He carried the quiet weight of a man who had seen too many quarrels end in blood, but beneath that stern exterior lingered a loyalty unshaken by time. He had known Jace since they were boys, had been the one to drag him from the burning barn years ago, and though distance had grown between them, he still watched over Jace in ways unspoken. When Clara stepped off the stage, Eli's gaze narrowed, not from suspicion, but from the knowledge that her return would stir more than memories. He tipped his hat in greeting, his voice even. "Clara Whitmore, Silver Creek hasn't seen you in a long while." She smiled faintly, the curve of her lips both familiar and new. "I promised I'd come back," she answered, her words steady, yet carrying the faint tremor of someone stepping into a destiny too large to name. Not all eyes on her were kind. Across the street, inside the polished windows of the saloon, Silas Hardin watched with interest. Silas was in his mid-40s, thick-set from indulgence rather than work, his dark hair slicked with oil and his mustache waxed to sharp points. He wore a tailored black suit that seemed out of place among the dust, a silver pocket watch glinting on his vest, and his fingers never strayed, far from the revolver at his hip. Silas was the wealthiest rancher in the county, owning half the land north of Silver Creek, and he was hungry for the rest. He had earned his empire not by sweat, but by crushing debtors, forcing families to sell at half their worth, and spreading fear like wildfire. To him, Clara was more than beauty. She was an opportunity. Her family's small but fertile parcel along the creek was one of the few he had not seized, and in his mind, marriage was just another contract, another acquisition. As he watched her step from the stage, his smile curved cold and calculating. "She'll do," he muttered into his glass of whiskey, though the saloon girl beside him shivered at the way his eyes gleamed. The townsfolk felt the shift in the air. Mrs. Dawson, flour still clinging to her apron, whispered to the blacksmith's wife. Children tugged at their mother's skirts, asking who the red-haired lady was. The blacksmith himself paused mid-strike, hammer suspended over glowing iron, staring as though he too remembered the girl who once spoke like destiny was hers to claim. Silver Creek, a place where rumors traveled faster than wind through grass, began to hum with speculation. And somewhere at the edge of town, Jace Callahan sat on his porch, muscles tense beneath his worn shirt, the faintest flicker of memory sparking in his blue eyes as he sensed the change. Redwind lifted his black head from the pasture, ears pricked, body quivering as if he too felt the storm rolling in. In Silver Creek, promises made in dust had a way of lingering, refusing to die even when the years tried to bury them. And sometimes those promises returned, not as echoes of laughter, but as choices sharp enough to carve the future. Clara Whitmore had come home, and the vow she had spoken long ago now stirred like a flame in the wind, a flame that would soon draw friend, foe, and fate alike toward its fire. The summer sun slipped low behind the Montana ridges, painting the skies above Silver Creek with strokes of violet and deep gold. Evening settled like a hush across the valley, carrying with it the mingled scents of fresh-cut hay, roasting meat, and dust rising from wagon wheels that rolled toward the old church hall. Tonight was the summer gathering, the one night when every family, ranchers browned by sun, women in cotton dresses, children in patch boots, came together under lamplight and fiddle song. It was meant to be a celebration, but as the lanterns were strung along the beams of the dance hall and tables sagged with pies and coffee pots, an undercurrent ran through the town. For weeks they had whispered about Clara Whitmore's return, and now they waited to see whether rumor would turn into truth. Inside the hall, the air shimmered with heat from too many bodies and the glow of swinging lanterns. Couples circled to the music of two fiddlers in the corner, the scrape of bows almost drowned by the stomp of boots against the polished floor. Along the edges of the room, families clustered, their talk dropping to murmurs as the doors creaked open. Jace Callahan stepped in first, shoulders broad enough to fill the frame, the lamplight glinting on the scar that marked his jaw. His shirt was plain, his vest dark, his frame a fortress of muscle that seemed to command silence by its very presence. At his side, Clara moved with a calm grace, the pale blue of her dress catching the glow so that she seemed almost luminous among the dim wood. Her auburn hair had been pinned back, but loose strands framed her face, and her green eyes swept the room without flinching at the stares that greeted her. The music faltered for a beat before stumbling back into rhythm. Men nudged one another, women leaned to whisper, children stilled mid-chase. The story of her childhood words, "One day I'll marry you," returned with renewed force, whispered across lips that had repeated it for a decade. Some watched with soft curiosity, others smirked with disbelief, but all eyes followed as Jace and Clara took seats along the wall, his frame sinking into a chair that creaked under his weight, her hand resting lightly in her lap. For a time, the music rose again, couples resumed their spins, and children darted beneath benches, though the laughter sounded thinner, as though it were played to cover expectation. At the far end of the hall, Silas Hardin stood, glass of whiskey in one hand, a crooked smile playing at his waxed mustache. His dark suit gleamed against the lamplight, his pocket watch chain catching the glow with every movement. He took a step forward, boots striking the boards with deliberate weight, and raised his voice in a tone pitched between jest and venom. "Well now," he said, drawing the attention of half the hall, "the giant of Silver Creek has found company this evening, and Miss Whitmore, back from the city, still clinging to a vow, spoken in the games of children." The words slid like oil, disguised as humor, yet sharp enough to cut. A ripple of laughter followed, uneasy, caught between fear of Silas and curiosity at the spectacle. "Promises spoken in play don't bind a woman," he continued, his eyes narrowing on Clara. "She'll come to her senses soon enough, and when she does, I expect she'll look for a man whose years have not already slipped away." The chuckles that followed were brittle, some covering their mouths, others shifting uneasily. At one table, Mrs. Dawson looked down, ashamed. Near the back, a ranch hand smirked and nudged his companion. The fiddles faltered, the dancers slowed, and silence gathered like a storm. Jace's hands clenched on the table, the veins on his forearms tightening, his jaw set in stone. His chest rose and fell in measured fury. Yet, he did not rise. The hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his answer. It came from another voice instead. Clara pushed back her chair, the scrape of wood against floor echoing louder than the fiddles had. Her boots struck the boards with each step until she stood in the open space at the center of the hall. For a moment, she seemed impossibly small against the crowd, but her back was straight, her chin lifted, and her green eyes burned steady. The silence deepened, broken only by the hiss of lanterns. Then she spoke, her voice ringing clear to the rafters. "I was a child when I spoke those words," she said, her voice unwavering. "But I am not a child now. I am a woman, and I keep my promises. I choose Jace Callahan, not out of foolishness, not out of memory alone, but because I know my heart." Her gaze swept across the hall, daring anyone to laugh. "And I will not be mocked for loyalty. I will not be pitied for loving a man of honor." The hall was stunned into silence. Some shifted uncomfortably, eyes falling to their boots. A few women exchanged glances of quiet respect, nodding almost imperceptibly. A young rancher near the back frowned, shame heating his face as he realized his laughter had rung louder than most. Even Mrs. Dawson raised her head, her eyes moist, lips pressed tight. Slowly the murmurs changed, not into more ridicule, but into whispers of agreement that spread like kindling catching flame. Jace rose then, towering behind Clara, his presence a wall of muscle and resolve. He laid a hand lightly on her shoulder, his icy eyes locked onto Silas. He spoke no words, for Clara had already spoken enough, but the weight of his silence carried like thunder. Silas's smirk faltered, and though he forced a scoff, his eyes slid away first. "Loyalty can be a sweet wine," he muttered, "until it sours." But no laughter followed him this time, and even the fiddlers, emboldened, struck their bows with firmer strokes. Music returned, hesitant at first, then surging as couples found their way back to the floor. In the corner, Sheriff Eli Grant leaned against a post, arms crossed, his brown eyes steady. He had not moved during the exchange, but he had watched every flicker of expression, every shift in the crowd. He knew Silas well enough to recognize the venom behind the man's smile. Yet he also saw what the town had witnessed. Clara Whitmore had not returned as a girl with a fanciful vow, but as a woman capable of standing in the center of ridicule and bending it back on itself. His jaw tightened with resolve. Tonight had shifted something in Silver Creek, and he would need to be ready for what might follow. Outside, tethered near the hitching post, Redwind reacted to the storm inside as though he had felt it through the walls. The black mustang reared suddenly, hooves striking the earth with a crack that startled other horses tied nearby. His mane whipped under the lamplight, his amber eyes fierce, and he let out a cry so piercing it carried into the hall itself, halting dancers mid-spin for a heartbeat. Ranch hands lingering outside exchanged glances, awe in their eyes. "That ain't no ordinary horse," one whispered, a lanky youth with straw-colored hair and patched overalls. "He knows his master's heart." Another, broad-shouldered and freckled, nodded with conviction. "Maybe he's more spirit than beast. Callahan's got himself a guardian." Their words spread quickly, carried by others who entered the hall to escape the chill. By the end of the evening, the tale had already begun to shift into legend, how even the wild itself had chosen to stand with Jace Callahan. When the last tune faded and families gathered children heavy with sleep, the hall spilled out into the warm night. Stars burned bright above the prairie, the air rich with the mingled scents of dust and sweet grass. Jace untied Redwind, the mustang still tossing his head proudly, and Clara walked beside him along the road that led back toward the ranch. They did not speak, but the silence between them was no longer emptiness. It was the silence of two who understood what had been proven. Behind them, Silver Creek buzzed with new whispers, but none dared laugh anymore. That night, the town had witnessed something it could not dismiss. Clara Whitmore had declared her choice. Jace Callahan had stood unshaken. And Redwind, black as midnight, had stamped his claim as more than flesh and blood. He had become a symbol, a spirit woven into the story of Silver Creek, as if even the wild plains themselves had cast their vote. The night after the summer gathering hung heavy and clear over Silver Creek, the last echoes of fiddle music still drifting like ghosts above the rooftops. Families had returned to their homes, lamps were doused one by one, and soon only the whisper of crickets and the soft hiss of the creek could be heard. Out on the edge of town, the Callahan Ranch lay quiet, its fences dark silhouettes against the star-soaked sky. The house itself, weathered but sturdy, sat beneath a stretch of cottonwoods that swayed gently in the evening breeze. On the porch, a single lantern glowed, casting a ring of golden light that spilled across the wooden boards and framed two figures who remained awake long after others had gone to sleep. Jace Callahan sat hunched in his rocker, the wood creaking faintly beneath his massive frame, his forearms braced on his knees. He had the look of a man carved from stone, every line of his jaw and shoulder weighted with years of solitude. But tonight there was something else in the set of his mouth, and the way his gaze softened when it turned toward Clara Whitmore. She sat beside him on the rail, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her pale blue dress dimmed in the lantern light, but her green eyes shining bright, reflecting the stars above. She studied him with quiet patience, waiting, for she had already shown the town her courage, but now she wanted to hear his truth. Jace exhaled, the sound heavy as if drawn up from years of silence. "I've carried my life like a yoke," he said slowly, voice low and rough. "Work, chores, cattle, horses, all of it easier than facing the quiet in these walls. After my brother died in that fire, I told myself there was nothing left for me but labor and silence. The folks in town, they look at me and see muscle, maybe steel, but inside, I've been hollow." He shook his head, his scar catching the lantern glow. "Then tonight, when you stood up for me, I felt something I haven't felt in years. Like maybe I hadn't been foolish to hold on to that childish promise. Like maybe, just maybe, I might be worth it after all." His words stumbled, halting, as if unused to being spoken aloud, and he fell silent with a heaviness that seemed to wait for judgment. Clara reached across, her slender fingers brushing the calloused back of his hand. When he didn't pull away, she twined her fingers through his, and her voice was calm but firm. "Jace, your worth isn't measured in what you lost. It's in what you've kept. You never stopped being faithful, even when no one saw it. I may have spoken foolish words as a girl, but tonight I chose you with clear eyes, not for the promise, but because I see your heart." Jace looked down at their joined hands, rough and tender, and the tightness across his chest loosened, as if a rope had finally given way. He managed a faint smile that seemed to surprise even himself. "Maybe I can believe that," he murmured, and though his voice was quiet, the words seemed to echo across the porch like a vow spoken into the night. Out in the corral, the mustang Redwind shifted restlessly, black coat shimmering like polished obsidian under the moon. His ears flicked, his nostrils flared, and then he lifted his head toward the porch, snorting softly as though acknowledging the moment. He did not come near, he was too wild for that, but the sound carried enough weight that Jace's gaze lifted and followed. Clara glanced too, smiling faintly. "Even he feels it," she whispered. Jace shook his head with a rueful chuckle. "He's only reminding me the wild doesn't give its loyalty easy. But maybe he knows I've found something worth standing for." Redwind pawed once at the dirt and settled, the lantern glow catching in his amber eyes, making him seem more sentinel than beast. While the ranch settled into fragile peace, the town sheriff made his rounds. Eli Grant, lean and wiry, his brown duster drawn against the cooling air, walked the boardwalk with the unhurried pace of a man who knew every creak of every board. His gray-streaked hair peeked beneath the brim of his hat, his mustache trimmed neat. And his eyes, brown, sharp, tired, missed little. He had kept Silver Creek steady through disputes over water rights, cattle rustling, and too many drunken brawls, but he knew tonight's gathering had shifted something deeper. Clara Whitmore had thrown her lot with Jace, and Silas Hardin's smirk had not gone unnoticed. Eli trusted that kind of smile about as much as he trusted a rattlesnake in tall grass. As he passed the shuttered saloon, a light still burned upstairs in Silas Hardin's office. That alone pricked Eli's instincts, and he slowed, boots whispering against the boards. Drawing into the shadows across the street, he tilted his head toward the narrow gap in the curtains. Inside, Silas leaned over a wide desk, his heavy body bent toward a spread of maps and deeds. His slick black hair gleamed in the lamplight, his thick fingers tapping at the paper as he spoke. Standing near him was Harlan Drew, one of Silas's hired hands. Harlan was younger, maybe 30, narrow-faced with a hawk nose, a thin scar at his jaw, his patched black coat hanging loose from his wiry frame. His hat was clutched in both hands, and his eyes darted nervously as Silas's words rolled like thunder. Eli could not hear everything, but fragments carried through the summer air. Debts, land along the creek, the Whitmore parcel, through marriage. He saw Silas stab a thick finger down on the map where Clara's family property lay. "The girl is the key," Silas growled. "Once she's mine, the rest falls in line. No Callahan will stand in my way." Harlan shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking toward the window, his jaw tightening as if the words curdled in his gut. Eli drew back further into shadow, his heart thudding. He had known Silas for years, had seen him squeeze families until they broke, buying their land for pennies when debt crushed them. But this was more than greed. It was strategy, sharpened to a point. Silas intended to claim Clara not out of affection, but as if she were another acred offense. Eli's jaw set, the lamplight glinting off the badge on his chest. He would not bring this to Jace yet, not without proof. The cowboy's temper would burn hotter than sense, and Eli feared it would lead straight to blood. He needed time to gather what he could, to stand ready when the storm broke. For now, he carried the knowledge alone, the burden heavy but necessary. As he turned away, Eli caught sight of the road leading out of town, the faint glow of a lantern bobbing far in the distance where the Callahan ranch sat. For just a moment, he pictured Clara walking there beside Jace, her hair catching the glow, her hand resting lightly against his arm. There was pride in the image, but also fear. She had chosen boldly, but Silas would not release his schemes lightly, and Eli's duty as sheriff had never felt more personal. Back on the porch, the hours slipped by unnoticed. Jace leaned back in his chair, his large hands now open on the arms instead of clenched, his gaze turned skyward. "All these years," he said softly, "I thought the stars were only to remind me how small I was. Tonight they don't seem so far anymore. Clara, her head tilted toward the heavens, smiled. That's because you're not standing under them alone. For a long time, neither spoke further, letting the night speak for them. The rocking chair creaked, the crickets sang, and Redwind's steady breath carried from the corral. For the first time in a decade, Jace Callahan felt not the weight of silence, but the promise of belonging. The following evening carried the heavy stillness that comes before a storm. Clouds drifted low across the Montana sky, muting the stars, while the prairie smelled of dust and pine resin, sharp in the cooling air. At the Callahan Ranch, a lantern burned on the porch, its glow casting long shadows across the boards. Jay sat silent in his rocker, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon, while Clara rested near him with her hands folded neatly, her auburn hair drawn back, but catching stray flecks of light. Redwind moved restlessly in the corral, his black coat gleaming each time the lantern flame caught him, ears flicking toward the road, as though some unseen warning already stirred in his blood. The sound of approaching hooves soon broke the quiet, the rhythm steady, deliberate, too controlled to belong to passing neighbors. Jace straightened, his hand lowering near his revolver, though he did not draw. From the gloom emerged Silas Hardin, seated tall on a bay gelding, his broad frame wrapped in a dark coat that gleamed faintly. Two riders followed close behind, rifles slung across their saddles, their eyes watchful but silent. Silas reined in at the gate, dismounted with calculated ease, and strode forward with the slow confidence of a man who had spent his life expecting doors to open before him. "Evening, Callahan," he said, his voice smooth, almost courteous, though the sharpness beneath could not be hidden. "I thought it polite to call. It seems Silver Creek has been buzzing about your newfound companionship. I wondered if the lady herself might enjoy hearing what I have to offer." His words dripped with false civility, his smile polished, but his eyes were cold steel. Jace rose to his full height, his shadow stretching long against the porch boards. "You've said plenty already, Hardin. Whatever you think you're here to offer, you can turn back with it." Clara stiffened beside him, though she said nothing yet, her fingers tightening against the edge of her skirt. Silas chuckled, the sound rolling low. "You mistake me, Callahan. This is not a quarrel, it is opportunity. Miss Whitmore deserves more than a life tied to an aging rancher whose best days lie behind him. She deserves land, influence, a name that carries weight. I can give her all of it." His gaze shifted to Clara, his smile widening. "You need only say the word, and all this, comfort, safety, prosperity, becomes yours." For a moment Clara's breath caught. The porch seemed to still, the air pressing against her chest. But then she drew herself upright, green eyes blazing, her voice rising clear in the night. "You think I am something to be bought, Silas. You speak of land and names as if they are chains to bind me. I will not wear them. I would rather live on this porch with nothing but silence than in your house with every luxury. My choice is mine, and I have already made it. I choose Jace Callahan." Her words cut sharper than any blade, and for an instant even the hired men looked away, unsettled by the conviction in her tone. Redwind let out a sudden cry that split the dark. The black mustang surged against the corral rails, hooves striking the dirt with such force that dust rose in clouds. He reared high, mane flying, nostrils flaring as he screamed again, and the sound sent Silas's gelding skittering backward, ears flat in alarm. The men reached for their rifles, but Jace stepped forward, his voice cold. "Easy with those guns. He's only reminding you the wild does not bow to men like you." Redwind stamped the ground once more, his amber eyes flashing like coals, then settled with a snort, his body still taut with power. Silas's smirk returned, thinner, harsher. "A beast can frighten children and women, but it does not change the truth. Land bends to power, Callahan, and so do people. You will learn this soon enough." He spat into the dirt, turned on his heel, and swung back into the saddle. With a flick of his reins, he and his men wheeled away, their silhouettes swallowed by the dark road. The ranch fell silent again, though the quiet hummed with the tension of what had just passed. Clara remained upright, her breath quick but steady, while Jace lowered his hand slowly from where it had hovered near his revolver. "He'll be back," she whispered. Jace's jaw tightened. "And we'll be ready." From the shadow near the barn, another pair of eyes had watched the whole exchange. Sammy Pike, a boy of about 12, thin to the bone, with straw-colored hair poking from beneath a cap, too large for him, pressed closer against the rough boards. His shirt was patched, his boots worn near through, his blue eyes wide with awe. Orphaned by fever and hardship, Sammy had drifted from field to field, sleeping rough and surviving on scraps, and tonight he had hidden near the barn, hoping for shelter. He had not expected to witness a standoff that shook him to his core. When the riders vanished, he edged toward the corral. Redwind's eyes caught him first, glowing faintly in the lantern light. The boy froze, his breath sharp, but the Mustang only tossed his head and pawed the dirt, as though acknowledging him. Sammy swallowed, his voice cracking in a whisper. "You're different. You don't bow. Maybe I don't have to either." Jace's voice rumbled from behind, startling him. "He doesn't bow to anyone, but he walks beside those he trusts." Sammy spun, ready to run, but Jace's stance was steady, his eyes calm rather than accusing. For a long moment the man studied him, taking in the patched clothes, the hollow cheeks, the fragile defiance in the boy's eyes. "What are you doing here?" Sammy licked his lips, trying to hold his ground. "I was looking for a place to sleep. I didn't mean to spy, I saw what happened. And the horse. I've never seen anything like him." His voice cracked, but he stood straighter. "I want to help. I can work. I swear it. Just give me a chance." Jace's face hardened, his instincts cautious. He had seen too much loss to open his doors easily. But Clara stepped beside him, her hand brushing his arm. "Let him try," she said softly. "He has no one else, and Redwind seems to have already seen something in him." Jace hesitated, then nodded once, his voice low. "All right. You'll rise with the dawn. If you can keep up with chores, we'll see if you earn his trust. But understand, this ranch is built on hard work, not pity." Sammy's eyes lit with a spark of hope that chased the dust from his face. He turned back toward Redwind, who stood silent and strong, the night breeze lifting his mane like a banner. For the boy, it felt like the start of belonging, and for Jace, it was a reminder that even those who had been lost could find their place if given the chance. By the time the lantern burned low, the clouds above had thinned, stars winking back into sight. The Callahan Ranch stood steady against the darkness, no longer only a place of silence, but of voices, choices, and unspoken vows. Silas had left with threats, but what remained was stronger. Clara's courage, Jace's defiance, Redwind's untamed loyalty, and the quiet faith of a boy who had finally found something to believe in. The morning of the wedding dawned bright over Silver Creek, the kind of clear Montana day that seemed to hold its breath with expectation. The little whitewashed church stood at the town's center, its freshly scrubbed walls glowing in the sunlight, its rafters decorated with wildflowers gathered from the hills and tied with simple twine. Families filed in wearing their best clothes, boots polished, hair slicked back or braided neatly. And though whispers still circled about age and promise, there was a sense of reverence that quieted tongues once they crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was warm, with the mingling scents of pine boughs strung across windows and lilac perfume dabbed behind ears. The pews creaked as ranchers and merchants, children and elders, shifted into their seats, voices hushed, eyes curious. At the front, Jace Callahan stood tall, broad shoulders filling the black coat he had brushed until it shone. His weathered face bore the scars of labor and loss, yet his steel blue eyes carried something softer, something lighter than anyone in town could remember. Beside him, Clara Whitmore radiated quiet strength in her plain white dress, auburn hair braided and woven with blossoms, green eyes steady as she looked upon the man she had chosen. Sheriff Eli Grant sat in the first pew, his duster folded neatly beside him, badge glinting faintly in the shafts of sunlight that cut through the windows. His eyes scanned the crowd, sharp and deliberate, remembering the words he had overheard from Silas Hardin nights before. He felt the weight of duty, not only as a lawman, but as a man tired of watching power grind down decency. His hand rested easily on his revolver, but his heart rested on the people he hoped would find their courage before the day was over. The preacher lifted his book, his voice low and solemn as he spoke of vows and fidelity, of storms endured together, of faith and love, binding two lives into one. His words fell like stones into water, rippling outward, and the church seemed to lean into them. When he asked the couple to speak, Jace's voice rose first, deep and sure. "I take you, Clara, to be my wife, for as long as I draw breath, through hardship and through peace." Clara's reply followed, clear and resonant. "And I take you, Jace, to be my husband, with all that I am and all that I will be." Relief swept through the pews like a breeze across tall grass, but the moment was shattered as the back doors slammed open. Sunlight streamed harshly into the church, and there stood Silas Harden, broad frame blocking the entrance, his dark coat hanging sharp against his boots polished to a mirror's gleam. His mustache curled with precision, but his eyes burned. At his side stood two hired men, their coats stiff with dust, rifles slung casually, though their hands hovered near. Silas strode down the aisle, the echo of his boots turning the murmurs into silence. "This charade ends here," he said, voice smooth, at first almost polite. "I come not to cause scandal, but to remind you all of truth. Clara Whitmore's family land runs along the richest stretch of this valley. Land my family has worked beside for decades. I alone can secure it. I alone can give her what she deserves. A girl's promise is one thing, but a woman's future is another, and she belongs with me." Gasps rippled through the crowd, some faces dropping, others tightening. The preacher faltered, clutching his book. Clara drew a breath, her hand tightening around Jace's sleeve. She looked out across the congregation, then back at Silas, her voice rising with a steadiness that belied the tremor in her chest. "I am no girl, Silas, and I am no one's property. I chose Jace Callahan before you, before them, before anyone. You cannot bend me like land or cattle, and you will not stand here and tell this town otherwise." The silence broke with a scrape of wood as Sheriff Eli rose. His revolver remained at his side, but his voice carried like iron across the room. "You've said enough, Harden. I know what you've been scheming, buying debts, planning to claim her land through marriage. This isn't about love or choice. It's about greed, and I won't let you poison this town further." His words struck the crowd like sparks to dry tinder, and heads turned toward Silas not with awe but suspicion. At the back of the church, Jesse Pike stood, wiry and weather-worn, his hands clenched into fists. "The lady's made her choice. She belongs to no man but the one she vows to." His wife Esther rose beside him, voice sharp. "This town has swallowed enough of your poison, Silas. No more." Their courage pulled others up with them, first a blacksmith with soot still on his hands, then a storekeeper, then a mother clutching her child. One by one, the congregation rose, forming a wall of voices and will that dwarfed even Silas's bluster. For a moment, violence trembled in the air. Silas's hand brushed the pistol at his hip, his eyes burning with humiliation. Then from outside came a cry, piercing and wild. Redwind's voice split the air, his scream echoing through the rafters, rattling the panes. He reared in the yard, hooves striking the earth, mane flying as though the storm itself had come alive. Even the geldings tied near the fence pulled and snorted, straining against their reins. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to conviction. "Even the wild stands with them," someone whispered, and the words spread like fire. The sound of Redwind's cry seemed to seal what had begun inside. This was no longer just a wedding, it was a line drawn in the dust of Silver Creek. Silas's face twisted, pride clawing at him, but the sheriff's revolver was steady. The townsfolk were united, and Clara's voice had already cut through his last veil. He was alone. With a hiss of breath, he turned, his boots striking hard against the aisle, his men trailing behind. At the threshold, he glanced back, his eyes burning with unspoken threat. But when the doors slammed shut behind him, the sound rang like defeat. The church exhaled, relief flooding the pews. The preacher, trembling but resolute, raised his book once more. "By the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." The cheer that erupted was not rehearsed nor polished. It was raw and human, laughter and tears mingling as people clapped and stamped their boots. Clara turned into Jace's arms, her face alight, and he held her with the strength of a man who had stood against storms and finally found home. Outside, Redwind tossed his black mane and let out one last cry, not of fury, but of triumph, and it carried across the valley like a banner. For Silver Creek, it became the sound of unity, proof that neither land nor wealth could break the will of people bound together. The days after the wedding carried a clarity Silver Creek had never known. The storm that had haunted the town for years seemed finally to have broken, leaving behind a calm sky and a community remade. Silas Hardin's name was no longer spoken with respect or fear. After his public defeat, his workers abandoned him, creditors came calling, and the sheriff's office at last dug into the crooked dealings that had kept him powerful for so long. His estate stood shuttered at the edge of town, its shutters banging against the wind like a hollow echo of the man who once thought himself untouchable. At the Callahan Ranch, life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and long overdue. Jace Callahan was no longer just the solitary rancher living with the ghosts of his past. He was a husband, and the light in his eyes showed it. Clara moved easily through the house and yard, not as a guest, but as the heart of a home. The porch, once silent, now carried the warmth of neighbors stopping by to offer congratulations, and sometimes even laughter that drifted down the valley like music. Sammy Pike woke before dawn now, eager to prove himself. He was thin still, his straw-colored hair forever unruly, his patched clothes tugged against his wiry frame, but determination drove him out to the barns each morning. He did not always succeed. More than once he spilled a bucket of water or startled a cow, but Jace corrected him with patient sternness, and Clara encouraged him with the kind of kindness he had never known. One evening, when Sammy dropped an armful of hay with a groan of defeat, Clara knelt beside him and brushed the hair from his brow. "Everyone stumbles, Sammy. What matters is that you stand back up." The boy straightened, chest swelling, as though her words had planted roots where none had grown before. Slowly, through error and effort, Sammy became part of the ranch. He began to smile in ways that belonged not to a guest or a beggar, but to a son. Sheriff Eli Grant felt the changes beyond the ranch as well. Where once suspicion and silence had reigned, people now greeted him with nods of respect, not fear. He watched with measured satisfaction as merchants set fairer prices, ranchers repaired fences together, and old feuds cooled in the face of something larger. He knew Silver Creek had not turned perfect overnight. Fights still flared, tempers still clashed, but there was a new current beneath it all, a willingness to stand together when it mattered. That spirit showed itself in the first barn, raising after the wedding. A rancher on the far side of the valley had lost his home to fire, and instead of muttering about debts or politics, the people came with wagons loaded with lumber, hammers, and food. Jace worked at the beams, his arms straining as he guided heavy timbers into place. Sammy scrambled up ladders, sometimes too quick for his own safety, and more than once Jace's booming voice called him back down, but the boy's grin never faded. Clara moved among the women, her voice steady as she helped organize meals and sewing. Sheriff Eli kept to the edge, overseeing, his sharp eyes softened by the sight of a town he had long feared was broken now mending itself. The moment that bound it all came late in the afternoon. The sun slanted red across the valley, and the frame of the barn stood tall, its main beam ready to be hoisted. Dozens of hands reached for ropes, men and women together, pulling in rhythm. The beam creaked, rising inch by inch. Just as it strained near the top, a cry split the air. Redwind, who had paced restlessly along the fence all day, reared high, his black mane flaring against the firelit sky, his hooves striking earth like thunder. The sound froze every hand for a heartbeat, then pushed them harder, as though the stallion's wild voice demanded they not falter. With one last heave, the beam slid into place, cheers rising as hammers secured it fast. Children shouted, pointing toward the mustang. Some whispered, "He's the guardian of Silver Creek." Others said simply, "He knows." Redwind did not linger. He dropped to all fours and broke into a gallop, circling the pasture, muscles gleaming, tail streaming behind him like a banner. Dust swirled in his wake, and for a moment every eye followed him until he vanished into the hills with a final echoing cry. The people returned to their work with new energy, laughter, and song rising as they finished the walls. When the last nail was driven, they sat down to eat together on rough benches, passing plates, telling stories, sharing pies and bread. Jace sat with Clara at his side, Sammy leaning against his arm, and for the first time in years, his face eased into a smile, unguarded and complete. Clara's hand found his, warm and certain, and he knew without speaking that whatever storms lay ahead, they would not face them alone. Sheriff Eli stood to speak before the meal ended, his voice gravelly but steady. "I've watched this town drift apart, and I've watched it come close to losing itself. But today, I saw something different. Today, I saw people pull the same rope. If we keep that spirit, there's nothing we can't carry." His words drew nods, murmurs of agreement, even applause. For once, he let himself smile openly. As lanterns were lit and stars spread across the wide sky, Silver Creek felt whole. Jace and Clara's vows had become more than a union of two souls. They had become a turning point for everyone. Sammy had found a family. The sheriff had found hope in his people. And even the wild mustang had become a symbol no one could deny. The valley lay quiet that night, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the peace of belonging, of unity, of hope carried forward. And though Redwind's black shape was lost in the hills, his spirit remained as untamed as the wind, as loyal as the hearts that had chosen to stand together. In the end, the story of Jace, Clara, Sammy, and Redwind is more than just a tale of a town that found its strength. It is a reminder that when we stand together with love, loyalty, and faith, God's hand moves quietly among us. The miracle is not always a flash of light from the heavens, but the simple courage to do what is right, the kindness to lift another soul, and the freedom to love without fear. Just as the people of Silver Creek discovered, God's blessings are revealed in unity, in family, and in hope renewed. Each of us can carry that into our daily lives, standing by those who are weak, forgiving where there is pain, and building homes of trust instead of walls of pride. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone you love, to leave a comment with your thoughts, and to subscribe so you will not miss more stories of hope and redemption. And if you believe, write Amen in the comments as a prayer for God's blessing to rest upon you and all who hear these words. May the Lord keep you, guide you, and fill your days with peace.